there's some wonderful art in this room, and this is my own version, something quite dramatic, the fall of Rome in AD 476. And I've titled this slide, The Fall of Europe. That sounds quite dramatic as we wander through this amazing city. You think, what on earth is he talking about? But I think we are at an absolute crossroads in this continent. Many of the slides we're going to look at the European Union. But I don't want you to think for 1 second that is chauvinistic, because I think the problems that my country, Britain, faces are every bit as great, if not actually greater. So this is a European-wide problem. We were a continent that was influential in the world, I think, for good, in art, in science, in literature, in music, and in prosperity. And I do not wish this to be the last generation of Europeans that can say that. But I think there genuinely is that risk. Let's see if I can work out the technology. Now, if we go back in time just to 1990, a short generation ago, the continent of Europe was, on a purchasing power parity basis, the most significant economic bloc in the world. Roughly a quarter of global GDP was European. That was somewhat bigger than the United States of America. And you'll note China accounted for 3% of global GDP. That's probably, in truth, an underestimate, but you can see the broad picture. Fast forward to today, Europe is down to 1/7 of global GDP in a short generation. China is now on a purchasing power parity basis, the biggest economy in the world, marginally overtaken America. A huge shift in power from the OECD to the rest of the world. Europe has been relegated to third place, but perhaps most shocking of all, within 10 to 12 years, if current growth rates continue, India will have a higher purchasing power parity basis GDP than all Europe combined, which I think is extremely concerning. Now, of course, there's a great difference between purchasing power parity and per capita wealth. Our continent continues to be much richer on a per capita basis, but others are catching up pretty fast. So if we look at the growth gap, in the 60s and 70s, Europe was regularly growing at between 3 and 5%. That moderated to about 2% in the 80s and 90s. But in the last 20-odd years, European growth has averaged round about 1%. Some people argue this is a developed world issue. This is a rich man's problem. I simply don't think that's the case. The second chart that's quite busy looks at European growth relative to the United States, Australia, and the world. And if we just flip over the slide, we'll see that if we look at other major developed countries, Australia has grown by 57% since 2005, OECD 42%, Canada 41%, United States 37%, Britain's managed 21%, and the Eurozone just 19%. So growth in the OECD has been roughly what we've double what we've achieved here. Now, these numbers, in a way are ugly, but they really, really matter, because if Europe had grown in line with the OECD, the economy today would be $3 trillion greater than it actually is, and that's equivalent to $8,500 per head of population of lost opportunity, a very large sum indeed. So, why has this happened? Well, the Romans knew how to party, and we can see the Romans are partying there, and arguably that led to their decline. Our form of party is different, but I think our form of party is a large state. It's a huge welfare state. It's very high tax, very high debt, and I think that is our form of decadence. So we're going to look at some of these issues. We're going to look at the debt explosion. We're going to look at high taxes. We're going to look at how I believe the state sector is crowding out private enterprise. We're going to look at rigid employment law, which I think is a huge impediment to growth, and a contrast the United States and even parts of China in terms of entrepreneurship with Europe. And it's a pretty sorry picture, I'm afraid. So if we look at national balance sheets, if I'd come here 25 years ago, Eurozone would have been roughly at the Maastricht criteria, 60% debt to GDP. Today, it is very close to 100%. But you will notice, you probably can't read it at the back of the whole, there's a huge differential, actually worse than Europe, the United States of America, which has seen a debt explosion of 80% of GDP. But in a European context, Greece, United Kingdom, and I'm sorry to say here, France, have all seen very substantial deteriorations in their balance sheet. But a number of countries have moved in the opposite direction. I'm notably thinking of Poland, Sweden, Denmark, and the Netherlands. So rising debt is not an inevitable consequence at all. But overall, European balance sheets have weakened. I think you're all aware of the tax situation in Europe, and there's actually a slide later on that puts it even more starkly against Asian and American countries. But European tax is substantially higher than any other global region at 42% of GDP. Now, in truth, that proportion has roughly stayed stable over the last 25 years. And again, within that, there's a very, very high variance, with a number of countries actually managing to cut tax materially. The most clear and obvious example is Ireland, which is probably not a fair example because being a very small country, they've had the ability to game corporation tax. But Sweden and Denmark, Sweden's interesting, the poster boy of the liberal left, actually has been moving away from its liberal roots. And while taxes are still fairly high in Sweden, the delta has improved. Unfortunately, Cyprus, Greece, the UK and Portugal have moved significantly in the other direction. In the UK case, I think this is particularly important because Britain had a reputation of being a fairly low tax, low regulation jurisdiction. That reputation is manifestly no longer true, and I think that's very dangerous in the medium term for European growth prospect, for UK growth prospect. Well, to the European Union's credit, they realized there is a problem, and I don't think the charts I put up are controversial. If you haven't read Draghi's report, Mario Draghi's report, I would urge you to do so. It's a very detailed analysis, and he talks about many of the issues that we've talked about, but that's as close as it gets to agreement, because his solution generally is more Europe, not less. It is centralization. Well, we believe actually the opposite is what is required for economic success, namely increasing the competition, market innovation, comparative advantage, market-based solutions, and a large dynamic private sector rather than something that's directed and centrally controlled. So Europe is by far and away the state-controlled region of the world. I think this chart underestimates actually how controlled Europe is because it looks at it from only one dimension, i.e. public spending as a proportion of GDP. But as we'll look at a little bit later, that ignores the regulatory angle, which is another aspect of state control. Europe it does vary from the jurisdiction, typically spends between about 44 and 55% of GDP on public spending. That's some 10 points higher than the United States of America and some 20 points higher than Asia. What we did was we looked at a control group of 21 major European and global comparative countries, and we simply regressed them. And what we found, it's not a perfect regression, I will accept, but a very broad line that for each 5% decline in the size of the state, growth tended to be about 1% per annum higher. So there's a choice here. It may be politically expedient to have a large state, but I think there's a clear link between the size of the state and underlying economic growth. And I think the reasons for that is I think the private sector is a better allocator of capital than the public sector. Not unsurprisingly, in common with a big state is big tax. And European tax is substantially higher on average than other regions. It's about 10 points higher than North America and about 20 points higher than Asia. And again, if we regress the tax take and GDP growth over the last 20 years, we find a reasonable downward sloping line. Relationship, again, is 5 to 1. So 5% reduction in tax in the long term should increase annual growth by about 1%. Employment law varies dramatically by country. Probably difficult to read from the back. United States probably has the highest labor freedom. With the highest labor freedom comes risk, of course, in terms of employment rights. France, I'm afraid, offers very generous employment rights, but as a result of that has a more rigid economy, and I would say possibly one that finds it harder to create new employment, particularly in growth areas. Europe's minimum wage, with the exception of Australia and New Zealand, is extremely high. That certainly undermines basic manufacturing industries and low-value industries, moving jobs eastwards. And I think the lack of flexibility in labour markets, which might be politically popular, actually comes at a very, very large price in terms of unemployment and growth. Energy prices, I don't want to get into a debate really about net zero, but it is a matter of fact that energy prices in Europe are exceptionally high. The larger your manufacturing base, the more problematic that is. It's clearly a substantial issue for Germany, but it's also an issue across the continent. In the UK case, unit power prices for industry are between 3 and 4 times that in North America. Little wonder the UK's manufacturing base is in very serious structural difficulty. The UK is in a different position to France. It has carbon assets. We've certainly recommended those assets. We've certainly recommended a market solution. I'm well aware that France has gone down the nuclear route, so it has a little bit more energy security than a number of European countries. But Europe needs to address its huge competitive disadvantage in energy. There's some uncomfortable questions about where it gets its energy source from. But I think what is extremely important is that people are aware of the price of various actions. And the current series of policy choices is exporting manufacturing jobs from the continent. This is, it's quite interesting. If you look at the biggest 10 companies in Europe, they're a lot smaller than the 10 biggest companies in America. That in itself is not the issue, really. But many of the largest companies in Europe are legacy companies. That is not to decry fantastic brands like LVMH or Hermes or L'Oreal or Siemens. You know, Europe dominates globally, and France in particular, in luxury goods. And those might be a troubled industry at the moment, but in terms of margins and profitability, clearly highly, highly attractive. But contrast that European list with the US list: NVIDIA, Microsoft, Apple, Alphabet, Amazon, Meta Platforms, Broadcom, Tesla. You have to come down to Berkshire Hathaway and JP Morgan to find legacy companies. America, like it or not, has actually developed global leadership in technology. Maybe you might say that's down to luck. Maybe it's down to economic geography, but the fact is they have and we have not. Of the top 100 technology companies in the world by market cap, which I accept as a shallow measure of technology, only 4 are European and 1 is British. That's a significant concern, I would say, for the long term. What I think is also quite interesting, and this contrasts with Draghi's approach. European approach is generally to back national champions. It's generally to support its own. But actually, contrast that with America, with the possible exception of Starlink and maybe Tesla, which have some government links. Virtually every other company is organic. It has been devised in a backyard, literally, and grown into multi-billion-pound businesses. It hasn't been directed by government or centrally. And I think there is a lesson in that. Now, I presented a pretty dire picture, but it's not all bad news. While in totality, Europe is not performing at all well, and its global influence, unfortunately, is in significant disarray, some European countries have performed, and there's been a tremendous differential over the last 20 years. I mean, Greece is a smaller economy today than it was 20 years ago. Italy is broadly flatlined. But at the other extreme, Ireland has doubled, and Poland and Sweden and Switzerland and the Netherlands have also performed reasonably well. I would take Ireland, as I mentioned earlier, out of the equation because I think it is gaming the tax system, and I think that's a little bit different to underlying productivity improvements which have benefited their society. But what I do think is, and you might say it's a coincidence, although I don't think it is, that the countries that have cut taxes have generally grown quite rapidly, and those that have raised taxes, the opposite has happened. Now, we'll probably... What I think, if I can find... What I think the real divide, though, isn't so much the 3 or 4 names I mentioned, but it's the Visegrad countries, the Baltic countries, some of the Eastern European states, and what I describe as old Europe, including the United Kingdom. It's not quite the right slide, actually. We'll come on to that. It's quite an important slide. Yeah. Let me find it. Yeah. So the Visegrad countries are catching up old Europe very significantly. Slovenia has just overtaken Spain in terms of GDP per capita, and on our estimates, by 2035, many of the former Soviet bloc countries will be at least as rich as the United Kingdom and France, and possibly marginally richer. Now, admittedly, some of this is catch-up from a very low GDP 20 or 30 years ago, but I think that's increasingly difficult to argue. That's the underlying case for their success as time has gone on and their GDP has caught up. Again, all 3 of them have lower debt, lower tax, and lower social spending. I think there are probably social and cultural issues at play here as well, which have aided their growth. But their taxes are typically 5 to 10% lower. Their debt to GDP is quite significantly lower in most cases. And they have closed the gap. Now, what I think is fascinating is that old Europe has gone for the model of effectively importing people. So it has a high welfare model, a lot of their citizens not working, and they've generally imported people into the labour market. Visegrad, the opposite's happened. They've had negative migration, and in some cases significantly so, over the last 20 or 30 years. The compounding effect of minus 1% population a year over 20 or 30 years is very significant. So actually, on a GDP per capita basis, it makes their performance even more important, more impressive. But I think it is also an interesting contrast to the model of Western Europe, and perhaps challenges the model that population change is the way to grow. So, is there any hope, or should we all just go home and weep? I think there is some hope, actually. I think the old model, I just simply don't think will cut it. I don't think either the UK or the European Union has smelt the coffee yet. But I think that there was some logic to what Europe was doing when there was a democratic presidency in the United States of America, or a sort of rhino, a Republican in name only presidency in America. And I think the unspoken strategy was that Europe would try and export its high growth model through net zero, through regulation, and import people to oil the wheels. And that would allow the the social model to continue. It was the management of decline, but it was an orderly decline. Maybe that could have worked, but I don't think it works any longer because President Trump, like it or not, has broken with that consensus. And we are now in a far more transactional world where power actually matters, and we've seen that in various trade deals, and we're certainly seeing that with the military situation or lack of that Europe has. So there's a basic choice. Our leaders can either turn a blind eye, and that's what they're doing in Britain to what's happened. They're pretending they're being nice to Trump, they're inviting him to the palace, and actually doing exactly the opposite, and besmirching him and going ahead with their status plans. But it's a very, very big bet, because unless you think that the change in direction in the United States is temporary and that Trump is an aberration, the gap between the US and Europe is only going to grow very much wider, far more prudential to take the tough medicine and start to fix what is a very broken house. So in our paper, and I'll go through these fairly quickly, but we can take questions later, is if we believe that this continent can be saved, and I absolutely believe it can. I think we've got enormous cultural and educational and industrial assets and soft power assets that could rebuild this continent quite quickly. We've come up with nine ideas. This can't be fixed overnight. No one is saying it can be, but we can start to move Europe in a different direction. First of all, I would say that we have to free up energy markets rather than state control and slavishly following net zero when, frankly, the United States, China, Russia, and India are not, and they account for the lion's share of emissions. We have to smell the coffee and be energy efficient. We are not at the moment. The second win is deregulating labor markets. I think minimum wages are very high. I think they're an impediment to employment. But it's not just minimum wages. It is the difficulty in hiring new people and changing labor forces, which might be cuddly, might be nice to the employee, but actually it has very damaging longer-term impacts, in my view. Third, we have reached a trade deal of sorts. I think more work needs to be done on that with the United States in goods and services. We also need to, tied in with the second point, empower our population with greater labour flexibility rather than importing cheap labour. And I think the Visegrad example is quite an important one there. Company formation, Europe varies a little bit by jurisdiction, but seriously lags. And I think we've got to trust the people on this rather than state direction. The example of America most certainly is that ideas tend to be organic rather than state planned. Our sixth point is Europe needs to become globally tax competitive. Easy to say that, quite difficult to achieve when Europe is running fiscal deficits. On average, 3% of GDP per annum, varies a lot between countries, but debt to GDP is at 100%. It will require a reduced state if we want to cut taxes. But if we don't do that, I think we're on the road to continuing underperformance. My seventh idea is that there's a torrent of regulation in the European Union and indeed in the UK. If anything, the UK is becoming more regulated actually than Europe, believe it or not, certainly in areas like net zero. I think there should be a presumption to repeal virtually every piece of legislation introduced over the last 5 or 10 years, unless there's an overwhelming reason not to do so. Our eighth idea, which again will not be popular in Brussels, is that we should learn the lesson of the Renaissance. The Renaissance was about competition between Italian cities. I think competition is the best way forward. Yes, Europe is a united and unified continent to an extent, but we should encourage a competition of ideas between different states. By that competition, we're more likely to iterate better ideas. And the last point is to examine much more closely the opportunity cost of the large state model. We believe very clearly that there's a strong correlation between the size of the inverse correlation between the size of the state and growth. Certainly, the empirical evidence over the last 20 or so years suggests that cutting the state will increase growth. I'm well aware to do so is painful, but it can be done gradually. If we set targets, for example, of a 5% reduction in the size of the state from, on average, between 44 and 54% of GDP, 5% less than that by 2035, and another 5% less by 2045, the state would still be very big. It would still be 35% of the economy, and I think that could be done by holding the state roughly at its current size and growing the productive sector. And the last point I'd make is, and the UK is a sinner in spades on this, I strongly believe in sound money. Running substantial fiscal deficits, I think, is the road to inflation and ruin in the long term. There has to be a control of the scale of budgets with a presumption to run a balanced budget in the medium term.
I fundamentally agree with what Ewen Stewart said, but I will say why it will not happen. It will not happen for two major reasons. And of course, afterwards, I will call on for a revolution in Europe, political and strategic revolution. The first reason why it will not happen, maybe I should say first that although I'm French, I did most of my studies in the Anglo-Saxon world. I have a master's degree from the London School of Economics and in economics, a master's degree in mathematical economics from Carnegie Mellon and a PhD from the Sorbonne. And I started working at the IMF and the OECD before teaching and counseling here in France. The two major reasons I believe it will not happen is that Europe missed the third industrial revolution. The first one was a steam power. The first one was in 1780s. It lasted for about a century. The second one was the electricity revolution, starting in the 1880s. And the third one is the digital revolution, which started in 1980s. Europe missed this revolution. And you showed just a few moments ago that all the leading companies in this digital revolution are American on our side and Chinese on the other side. And what's happening for Europe is that it started about 20 years ago, but there is a competition between China and the United States to lead the world. We often read in the papers, or we can read economic papers about this, but we don't understand what it means. We are not mentally prepared to understand what it means. In Europe, we belong to the past. As minds are set to think about comfort, holidays, to think about two countries fighting for world domination. It's something we could have understood in the 19th century. Britain and France were competing for world domination. Later, at the end of the 19th century with Germany, it was the major reason for the First World War, the competition for world leadership between the UK and Germany. So because of the two world wars, when we created the first economic community and later the European Union, the major principle which is embedded in the Treaty of Rome is that Europe should never, never, never be again a power. It is the crucial principle that is the starting point of the Treaty of Rome. And the backbone of the Treaty of Rome is competition. But as we'll see in a minute, it's competition in a bureaucratic way and not in a business way. So Europe missed the third industrial revolution. What's very interesting is that England, France, and Germany were at the forefront of the first two industrial revolutions, and we totally missed the third one, which is the main reason of slow growth in Europe. Now, we have to really have in our head the three numbers that I will quote. You already said some of the major points, but if you look at the last 20 years, the average growth of Europe was 1% a year. United States was above 2%, and China was about 7-8% over the last 20 years. But when you look, I've worked in my new book, numbers of what you could expect for the next 10 years. What we can expect is again 1% growth in the European Union and probably the UK, 2% or above for the United States, and China will probably go down to 3 or 4% growth for the next 10 years. But if you accumulate this growth rate over 10 years, what you showed is going to continue. Europe is fading in the strategic world. We are becoming a museum, but we are missing this industrial revolution and what's going on from it. Just a few more numbers to comfort and go along what Ewen said. When you look at the strategic world, the United States and China, you gave numbers of GDP in dollars. When you look at statistics in World Organization, it's in PPP, purchasing power parity. So I worked what I call power GDP, a new concept, which is very simple. I take 2/3 of dollar GDP and 1/3 of PPP. Why do I do that? If you do all the analysis in PPP, you under-evaluate the Western countries. If you do it in dollars, you over-evaluate. If you take Burundi, its GDP in PPP will be 3 times its GDP in dollars. But if Burundi wants to buy an Airbus, it will have to pay in dollars. So I derived this concept of power GDP, and if you do that, donc the United States and China represent about 43.5% of world GDP. Europe has fallen to 17%, and we will continue to go down. If the growth rate I mentioned continue, we will be below 15%. When you take the 43.5% of China and the United States, the US is about now 23.5 and China 20. If you take individual countries like Germany is a little bit more, but France and the UK were around 3%. So we have become small actors in the world as individual countries. And what's even more important, China and the United States, although they represent about, as I said, slightly over 43% of GDP, they represent 55% of military spending. You have to correct the military spending of China. If you analyze it with American concepts, you have to double the spending of China. Most of the spending, military spending of China is distributed in other ministries rather than defense ministry. They represent 80% of world unicorns and 100% of the leading digital platforms. So these two countries are totally dominating the world. And you said it, but the United States for 80 years has been building the world around the rule of law. And the European Union was a subset of American rule of law. Now, if the leading nation of this system, which was serving the interest of the United States, contrary to what Trump says that it was costing the United States. It's a colossal strategic mistake. It was serving the interest of the United States. When you had the competition between the USSR and the US, the USSR had to work inside the American system, whether they liked it or not. China had to do the same in starting when it started its evolution. And all you see now is China trying to get out of the American system, and Trump is helping China get out of the system with another major mistake done by Trump. It's a colossal mistake. It's infuriating India, which was one of the major countries maintaining the world order, and Trump is pushing India towards China, which is, in terms of strategic issues, a colossal mistake for the future. Now, when you see Europe in this way, in this strategic world, I use an image. If you imagine the strategic geography of the world as a chessboard of about 100 meters by side, you can think of the United States as a steel ball of 3 meters of diameter. You can think of China as a steel ball of 2.5 meters of diameter. Russia is a small country in economics, but it has 6,000 nuclear heads. So you can think of India and Russia with as steel balls of 1 meter diameter. Now think about what is the European Union, even if you include the UK. But taking the European Union as it is a plastic bag within which you have 27 wood balls. The wood ball of Germany is about 80 centimeters. The wood ball of France is about 60 centimeters. The wood ball of UK is about 60 centimeters. But if you just take the European Union, it's a plastic bag with the 27 balls inside. Now you put the plastic bag on this chessboard, and you have these steel balls moving very fast. What happens when the China, Russia, India, American balls arrive on the plastic ball? It explodes. That's what Europe is now. So the problem is that fundamentally, because of the Treaty of Rome and how it was conceived, Europe has become a bureaucracy. And it's not a bureaucracy in political terms or in journalistic terms. It's a bureaucracy in terms of economic analysis. We have now 3 Nobel Prizes in economics, in economic theory, that have analyzed bureaucracies. And Europe is fundamentally a bureaucracy. It works as a bureaucracy. It works by the rule of law. All Europe does is to produce regulation. Does nothing else. Now, this worked in the nice world of the second revolution. From 1957 to say the third industrial revolution, the digital revolution, accelerated from maybe 2000. But before that, it worked. But in the new world, and if you add that Trump has changed the international organization by denouncing the system constructed by the United States itself, then Europe is a subsystem, bureaucratic system, unorganized as a power. By the Treaty of Rome, the European Commission has had 2 responsibilities. The first one was competition policy. The second one was commercial policy. The European bureaucracy has failed on the two subjects. I'll just, and I will finish. I just mentioned competition policy. There is a major difference between competition policy as conducted by the European Union and the United States. In Europe, the European Commission has imposed static analysis of competition. It works on your influence on the market, share of the market. In the US, competition is including technology. So in Europe, if you have a firm with 45% of market share, the European Commission considers before analysis that there is a problem. In the US, if a firm has a 45% share of the market, but if it is through technological improvements, if it brings to consumers value added with falling prices, the USA it's fine. So in Europe, we don't take into account competition through technology. If you would take commercial policy, Europe has totally missed what happened in China. China entered the World Trade Organization in 2001, just after September 11, because the US, after opposing it for 15 years, allowed China in for political reasons. But China came in without signing two major part of the World Organization, Trade Organization. First, forbidding state subventions, and second, organization of the internal market of China, and the fact that China has been allowed to answer state buying, when in China European firms cannot enter the market for state buying. So if you consider these two only responsibilities of the Commission, it has failed. So we have a European Union which is bureaucratic, which has missed the digital revolution, and it cannot change. And if you have a China and the US, which are moving day by day, hour by hour, making decisions very fast, investing massively in energy, in technology, in defense, in biotechnologies. Now, I said you have to add to have three numbers in your head. For the next 10 years, Europe at 1% growth, US at 2%, and China at 3%. You have another set of numbers to have in your mind for biotech, space technology, digital technology. China is investing 5 times more than the European Union, and the US 10 times. So we have to completely redirect our policies, but it will not happen unless we have a total institutional revolution in the European Commission. And I will express and indicate some of the evolution we need in the construction of Europe in the questions you may have. Thank you.